All right. Bismillah wa alhamdulillah wa salawat wa salam ala rasulullah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa min wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, members of ISIP, participants from all over the world, mental health professionals, students of knowledge, seekers of knowledge, scholars, alimas, all of you who are joining, we're very honored to have you all with us. First and foremost, please forgive us for being a little bit late today. We needed to do some technical facilitation and some marketing in advance. So my sincere apologies for being a little bit delayed. Thank you so much for your patience with us. And we're very honored to have you all with us. As you guys know, we've been now for almost 2 months within the ISIP, the International Students of Islamic Psychology. We've been doing a lot of activities highlighting the situation in Palestine from a psychological and Islamic psychological and Muslim mental health point of view, trying our best to to disseminate knowledge, to further strengthen our colleagues who are working on the field and on the ground in Palestine and Gaza and West Bank, and also to create both healing and resilience circles where people can meet and just grieve together, and through sohbah and companionship find strength in one another and learn from each other's experiences, and also to bring about advocacy for the plight of the Palestinians. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for all of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, both within Palestine and also in the diaspora. And our focus is to deal with the situation and to build advocacy and build a companionship focusing on mental health and psychology. This is the objectives of ISIP generally. And we have done a couple of lectures and webinars. A couple of weeks ago, we did a lecture with Dr. Samah Jabar, one of the leading psychiatrists in Palestine. She resides in Jerusalem, which was a very interesting lecture. We learned a lot from her experience as a mental health professional. And we're going to have a strategic partnership between ISIP and her organization as well, inshallah, which is very important for us. A couple of weeks ago, we also had a webinar with Dr. Yasser from Gaza Mental Health Network, and Dr. Iman and Dr. Denise, who are all Palestinians and mental health professionals, where we try to get the ground perspective of the situation in Palestine from a mental health point of view, and how we as an international movement and how we as mental health professionals can support the psychiatrist work in Gaza and in Palestine as a whole. Sister Fatima, who's one of the co-founders of ISIP, she has, together with our colleagues and ISIP's task force for crisis support group, conducted once a week resilience and healing circles, which has been, alhamdulillah, a safe space for just companionship, sohbah, and also a place where we can find strength in each other through these times of trials and tribulation with regards to Palestine. And we're planning to do a lot of other initiatives as well. We're doing a lot of infographics, trying to bring about awareness and advocacy for the plight of the Palestinians through social media, posts, etc. And we're planning to do a lot of other task forces and initiatives. If you guys want to join the ISIP movement and organization, throughout the webinar today with Dr. Tarek, we will share resources in the Zoom chat, both WhatsApp groups for our resource sharing and discussions groups, also how you guys can join our crisis support group. Our plan is to continue to work for the advocacy of the Palestinian cause throughout all years until the day that Palestine becomes free, inshallah. We're never going to stop, inshallah. So this is an ongoing initiatives that we're going to facilitate. And we will also inform you guys how you can join our movement and be part of this international initiative of ISIP, inshallah. Feel free to use the Zoom chat to introduce yourself, dear brothers and sisters. It will be open throughout the session. If you have any questions to Dr. Tarek, feel free to share them in the Zoom chat, and I will address them to Dr. Tarek in the end of the session during the Q&A activities that we will conduct. And thank you once more for joining us. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala free Palestine. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring ease to all of our Palestinian brothers and sisters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring resources to all of our Palestinian colleagues, mental health professionals who are working on the ground, doing such an important work. And hopefully we can, through the lens of Islamic psychology, be at service for all of our colleagues in Palestine and all over the world, inshallah. We pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy for all of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, for all of our brothers and sisters in Myanmar, in India, in East Turkestan, also in Yemen, in Syria, in Sudan, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Europe, and in West generally, due to what we're facing, which is also the topic that Dr. Tarek will speak about, Islamophobia. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for all of us and strengthen all of us and allow us to live in peace and prosperity with our fellow brothers and sisters in humanity in the near future, inshallah ta'ala. Today's lecture, dear brothers and sisters, will be about Islamophobia in psychology and why it matters for Palestine, together with Dr. Tarek Younis from the UK. We have had the honor to host Dr. Tarek previously in another lecture he did, which was very appreciated by all of our members. And we're very honored to conduct this session with Dr. Tarek today. It's a very important topic for the plight of the Palestinians, but also generally for all Muslims, the connection between mental health psychology and racism and Islamophobia. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So today's agenda, dear brothers and sisters, we will start by just reciting Surah Al-Fatiha. So let's start with that, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Malik yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen. So we will just go through some of the guidelines of our webinars and how we conduct them. Then after that, we will have a lecture with Dr. Tarek. After the lecture, we will have a Q&A session, and it's going to be a little bit more unconventional lecture today. Dr. Tarek will not have any slides. He will just speak directly from his heart, and I will also ask some questions throughout the session, and then I will address your questions to Dr. Tarek throughout the Q&A session, and we will close with some closing du'as as well, inshallah. Briefly about the Zoom etiquettes, dear brothers and sisters. If you can, put your cameras on. It's always good to see each other and to connect with one another. And use the gallery view that Zoom has to offer to see all of your brothers and sisters from all over the world. It makes us feel connected, and we will then see that we're actually a strong movement with members from all over the world. And when we are united, inshallah, we will succeed. Keep your microphone muted at all times, please. This is for the benefit of the lecture. Rename yourself if possible. Add your name and the country where you reside, just for us to see where you guys come from and where we come from. It's always beautiful to see the diversity of all of our members in ISIP and also all of those who are benefiting from our initiatives. Always utilize the chat option if you have any questions or reflections. We will also share some beneficial resources to you throughout the session. Finally, dear brothers and sisters, if you have if you need any live transcription, feel free to press the more button in the Zoom application and request for live transcription, and then you will be able to access that, inshallah. All right, a little bit about ISIP, dear brothers and sisters. ISIP, the International Students of Islamic Psychology, we're trying to be an inclusive space designed to connect people with diverse backgrounds interested in the field of Islamic psychology. So our movement is established by brothers and sisters from all over the world, from different professional backgrounds, and also students and seekers of knowledge and scholars. And we try to, unite people who are interested in Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology and do want to learn more and to practice and apply it. And it doesn't matter which background you have, you're more than welcome to join. We try to do all of our things free of charge because our aim is to disseminate knowledge, share resources, and discuss best practices. And by making it free of charge, we want to reach out to all people, no matter which social, economical background you have, so you guys can benefit from the sacred knowledge of Islamic psychology. We also want to be a platform to enable further development of people's personal and professional interests, studies and understanding of Islamic psychology and Muslim mental health within their communities and countries of origin. So we have a lot of local and regional chapters all over the world. ISIP has over 30,000 members from over 90 countries and nationalities. We have over 30 local and regional chapters all over the world. And it will be such an honor if you would like to join our initiatives, our resource sharing groups, our local chapters as active members, other task forces that we're doing as well. We have a trauma healing task force. We have a research center called Al-Balkhi Institute. We have online Islamic psychology counseling platform called Rafiq Counseling. All of this is at your service. Ways to participate in the ISIP movement, dear brothers and sisters and excellent colleagues. Feel free to subscribe to our ISIP YouTube channel. My colleague, Sister Fatima, will share the link. By subscribing, we're trying to break the algorithm of YouTube so that more beneficial knowledge can be shared. Feel free to join our Islamic Psychology WhatsApp group for research sharing. And also, if you want to join ISIP, you can go to our website, www.isip.foundation. Membership is free of charge, and then you can get access to our digital library with over 1,000 resources connected to the field of Islamic psychology and Muslim mental health. And if you want to join any of our local regional chapters or task forces, feel free to reach out to us through email, through WhatsApp, and we will be more than honored to bring you with us. And if you do not have any local chapter of ISIP in your region or country, feel free to reach out as well. We will be honored to establish it together with you, inshallah, dear brothers and sisters. Jazakallah khair. This is a way to join right now. If you want, you can use this QR code to join our Islamic Psychology Research Learning Group. And now let's go to the main person of the venue today, Dr. Tarek Younis. Dr. Tarek Younis is a senior lecturer in psychology at Middlesex University in London, UK. He teaches on the impact of culture, religion, globalization, and security policies on mental health. He's a researcher and published writer on Islamophobia, racism, and mental health, the securitisation of clinical settings, and the politics of psychology. He's also a cultural and clinical psychologist offering therapy in community settings. And as a registered clinical psychologist, he primarily attends to experiences of racism, Islamophobia, and state violence in his private practice. His book that he released is called The Muslim State and Mind, Psychology in Times of Islamophobia. So we will also share the feedback form in the end of the session, inshallah. And by the way, next Saturday, the 16th of December at 11:30 a.m. GMT, we will conduct a lecture with Sheikh Idris Watts, also from the UK. This lecture will not be related to the Palestinian cause. It's going to be part of our general lectures in Islamic psychology. The lecture's title is A Somatic Approach to Islamic Psychology. Sheikh Idris is one of the leading scholars and practitioners of Islamic psychology, and he has developed a modality in how to work with somatic experiencing in relationship to Islamic psychology. So we highly recommend you, dear brothers and sisters and colleagues, to join the lecture. We will share how you guys can register to the lecture in our WhatsApp groups and social media platforms. Feel free to also join our social media platforms of ISIP on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter as well, inshallah. All right. This is how you can register to the lecture, by the way, and we will share the link in the Zoom chat. Without any further ado, let me now allow brother Dr. Tarek to join the lecture. It's an honor to have you with us, Dr. Tarek. So, Bismillah, welcome to the webinar today. Looking forward to learn from you, inshallah.
Barakallahu feekum. Jazakallah khair for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you all for coming, for everyone who's here. A special thanks to ISIP that's given so much time to the things that matter most, I think, for us in the community. For giving me the opportunity to speak, which we might take as a given, but there's been opportunities where I've been withheld from speaking. So anytime that anyone ever allows me to be able to share my voice, it's one that I have a deep appreciation for. I begin in the name of Allah, Bismillah, Rasulullah. I just also want to dedicate today's talk, as I've been dedicating all my talks on Palestine, to a young 3-year-old, Ahmed Shabet. I'll just quickly tell you his story. Ahmed Shabet survived the first initial bombings by Israel, but he lost his immediate family, his 4 siblings, and his parents. He then survived. He then stayed with his uncle, and the house in which he was staying in, or the area, the space that he was staying in, was also then bombed. And he lost his uncle and others around him, and he also lost his legs. He was then taken in by extended family, where he stayed with them, and then subsequently was also bombed again, and he survived while the members of his extended family passed away. And so I don't know where he is right now. I just know that there's a 3-year-old boy who has lost all of his extended family in numerous bombings. And he's also lost his legs, and as his uncle had explained before he had passed away, that the little boy was still trying to get up and walk around as he normally would, as what we expect from our children. And so I dedicate this to him, just so that we know what the context is of, or the necessity of the context that we're talking about. Today's lecture is going to be slightly different. So for anyone who knows me and knows my work, you're going to hear a lot of things that I've never really spoken about before, but things I've been researching and taking notes of for a long time. So today is almost kind of, I would say, partly a trial, trying to get also some valuable feedback from everyone. So if anyone has any thoughts or ideas, do feel free to note them down and share them with me. Any questions, obviously, as well. I'll be talking today about the role of Islamophobia in psychology, which I've been teaching and writing about for a long time. But I'm going to also now put a particular emphasis on Palestine. And the reason I thought is important for us to have this sort of conversation is that I noticed among mental health professionals, Muslim mental health professionals, or mental health professionals in general, is that we tend to localize our concern for Palestine to something that's happening over there, right? So when we talk about Palestine, even when we talk about Palestinian mental health, we're talking about something happening over there, right? And this is something that we have to question. In fact, we need to return it because we can't simply locate the question of Palestine to a particular space, to a particular area. The fact of the matter is that the question of Palestine is relevant in what it's revealing all across the global north. Yeah, it's revealing how psychology is operating. It's revealing how politics is operating here, particularly in the global north. And I'll make a quick footnote. I'm well aware with the popularity of ISIP that there's people with us today from all across the world. There's two reasons I'm going to be focusing here on the global north when I'm talking about Europe and North America in particular. One, because that's my area of specialty and expertise, but two, in fact, what we see very, very blatantly is how much actually the violence towards Palestinians is something that is operationalized very systematically from this area, right? And insofar as psychology, psychiatry, the mental health disciplines are also artifacts of European history, there's already a very distinct necessity to focus on the global north and try to understand, well, what's the framing, what's the understanding of Palestinians and Muslims in global north psychology, okay? I also want to distinctly highlight one of the main things that I think many people are seeking these spaces for, and sort of to acknowledge the suffocation that, especially for us in the global north, in wanting to mobilize for our children like Ahmed Shabet, and how that's managed and disciplined in the global north, and to find these spaces. And this is something I'm going to speak to, but this is not exactly the space for that. The purpose of today, and what I'm going to try to do is give actually quite a breadth of different ideas. And you're going to have to forgive me for this already. I'm going to cover a number of different topics, but I'm going to try to give it in a narrative, in a story that makes sense. And there's a reason why I'm doing this is because I could, for example, just focus on the role of just Islamophobia in psychology. But what we want to do is start unpacking all the different nuances of the topic or the intersection between psychology, Islamophobia, and Palestine. And to do that, we actually need to cover a number of different topics at the same time. Okay, so today is going to be a trial in trying to unpack that in inshallah, it's going to hopefully be far less than an hour. The outline for today is actually quite simple. First of all, I'm going to explore the politics of psychology. Yeah, where is the politics of psychology? Where do we locate the politics of psychology? Two, then I'm going to go into Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism in psychology, once we understand where the politics of psychology can be found, we're going to go into Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism in psychology. From that theoretical understanding, we're going to build into the material understanding of how racism is institutionalized and legitimized through psychology. And there I'm going to have a particular focus in on counter-extremism and counterterrorism policies and the growing marriage between counterterrorism and psychology. And then fourth, I'm going to look at some of the limitations of maybe other ways of addressing the issue of Palestine, or the concern for Palestine. And one of those ways is going to be about thinking of Palestine, particularly through a lens of mental health and trauma. And then hopefully we can end with some ideas of where we have to move forward when we consider the immaterial and material conditions by which Palestine, Palestinians, Muslims, and particularly Palestinian solidarity is managed and disciplined through psychology. I hopefully will be able to keep my eye on the chat if there's anything that needs to be clarified, but hopefully with examples, I pray that inshallah, the narrative is going to be clear. Okay, so let's begin with the politics of psychology. For us here in the global north, I think following October 7th and particularly the genocide that we're seeing, it's been quite a revelatory moment for many of us, where we're not only having to confront the silence of many professional bodies, but also often their complicity, right? And if I speak directly here, for example, in the UK where I'm based, we know that the British Psychological Society and the Royal College of Psychiatrists haven't issued any statements on Palestine. But that doesn't mean they're apolitical, right? They've issued statements on Ukraine. And in fact, many mental health and bodies of psychology and psychiatry have issued statements and made points on Ukraine across the global north. And in fact, the Royal College of Psychiatrists even changed the color of their logo on social media to the colors of Ukraine. In the United States, the American Psychological Association also hasn't published anything. They published a statement condemning Hamas and then the alleged violence that comes following October 7th as being one that's affecting Israel and Palestine equally. But there was one exception, and that's within the American Psychological Association, which is Division 48, the peace psychologists. So the American Psychological Association has all these different subdivisions, and one of them is the peace psychologists. And they issued a statement that joined the UN in calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. And what happened following that, and remember, the question that you're asking yourself in your mind is, where is the politics of psychology? Yeah, so following the only division in the American Psychological Association that published a statement joining the UN in calling for a ceasefire, according to Roy Idelson, once that division of peace psychologists issued that statement on Gaza, there's others from within the division of peace psychologists who turned against the leaders and the leadership for making that statement. They called the statement anti-Semitic and blame it on the fact that the majority of the division leaders who supported the statement come from Muslim majority countries. Okay. And now, from what my understanding from that article that Roy Adelson wrote, the statement was then retracted for the call of ceasefire. And this is what I'm putting forward. I really want us to hold on to this question, right? Because we don't hold on to it long enough. We kind of feel the suffocation of it, but we don't hold it in our hands. What is the political significance of this? Yeah, there's a lot of talk of the fields of psychology and psychologists being experts of human behavior, human thinking, and yet they're displaying the most profound ignorance of all with very little political literacy. And again, I'm asking that question, what is the political significance when the professional bodies here in the global north are either silent or directly complicit in supporting the genocide of Palestinians? And this question of what the political significance of this is one that's actually very difficult to unpack, because in a way, one of the things that we are facing is, well, in a way, what's the politics of psychologists, right? And I'm going to point out an article right now, okay? There's an article that was written by an Israeli psychologist in 2001. And he questioned, his name is Dan Baron, and he questioned why there isn't post-Zionist psychology in Israel, right? So he's asking, why is it that we're seeing a degree of criticality among Israelis in other professions, sociologists, historians, as to the very project of Zionism? And as a prominent Israeli psychologist himself, he's asking himself the question, why is it that we don't see such similar criticality among psychologists in Israel in particular? And though I feel like he's speaking to Israel, and this is something I'm writing about and I'm unpacking further, I think it matters for all of us. So he mentions 2 points. He actually mentions many points, but there's 2 I'm going to talk about. One is or I'm just going to mention very briefly. One is that there's inherently this conservative individualizing impulse in mental health disciplines to localize our attention on ourselves, literally ourselves, right? There's this depoliticizing impulse to just focus on people's experiences. And when you focus on people's experience of something, it has this this impulse really to detract from the context that the person's experience is localized in. Okay, so there's this individualizing impulse, and therefore it lends itself to this very sort of conservative way of looking at issues, which is all about the individual. He also talks about psychology's proximity to state structures, and particularly the military. And I think it's very important here to understand that what's, I think, significant is that there is obviously diversity of voices. And actually, this is a side point that I was reading into as well, because I was interested in the good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic, which I'm going to get to later. But there's also the good Jew, bad Jew dynamic. And there was one element that we're seeing in today's discourse, is this idea of Jews who are critical of Israel, are self-hating. And there was a very interesting article written by Finlay, who looks at how, in fact, this notion of self-hating, a self-hating Jew, was there was a psychopathological element to it, that for someone to hate themselves, the self-hating Jew who might be critical of Israel, has also been psychopathologized. And this is something maybe I can unpack later in writing, but I think is very interesting when we look at it and put it side by side with the good Muslim, bad Muslim, which I'm going to get to, right? All of this is to say that the field of so I'm talking about professional bodies. Yeah, I'm talking about maybe certain ideas, trying to make sense as to why the field of psychology itself lends itself to being so depoliticized. But it's really important for me to emphasize here that psychology is not apolitical. Rather, what it's doing is that it's reflecting a very particular politics, and not just any politics, but the sort of dominant geopolitical status quo. And we see this very readily in studies on psychology. And if you ever want to, if anyone here is obviously supportive of Palestine and you want to hurt yourself in any way, shape, or form, you can search the psychology databases often on Palestine. And I was surprised because I didn't see this review article, but there's a professor by the name of Nader Hakim, who I was just in communication with. He actually did a review article on the framing of Palestine in experimental psychology. And he just published this review article earlier this year. So he did an analysis as to how in experimental psychology. So in experimental psychology, as hopefully, or as maybe some of you might not know, it's a field of psychology where you actually do literal experiments, comparisons to be able to explore a certain subject, right? And when you look at the field of experimental psychology and how actual experimental studies are conducted in Israel-Palestine, he found 92 articles. So there were 92 experimental there were 92 articles comprising of, I think, over 100 experiments. And he noted that only a fifth of these articles, so 18 of the 92 articles that were conducted on Israel-Palestine, mentioned occupation. Just occupation, just the fact that Palestine is under occupation is, the Palestinian territories are under occupation. Only 1/5 of them mentioned the word occupation, and a fourth of them mentioned settlements. And he concluded that the majority of articles in mainstream experimental social psychology fail to categorize the situation in Israel and Palestine as one of occupation and/or settlements. And even fewer of them, only 7 of 92 articles, even referred to Zionism at all. Okay. So there's something very clear here in how we have to understand, obviously, the way Palestine historically has been framed within the side disciplines. And I'm very well aware that many people have written about this already, right? So it's important to acknowledge that what I'm doing right now is not speaking about how Palestine, scholars have spoken about how psychology and psychiatry and mental health operates within Palestine. That's something that's often been discussed. What I want to do now is speak to the relevance of everything I'm saying here in the global north. So that brings me to my next section, which is thinking now about why this is relevant for Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism here in psychology, here in the global north. There's an article by Elizabeth Berger and Dr. Sameh Jaber, who's been here on ISIP before, who give and outline 5 different case studies on how Palestinian activism and solidarity is disciplined in North American mental health settings. They give an example of a Palestinian therapist who received a complaint from a potential patient in the global north. There's a Palestinian therapist. They're about to see a patient, and the patient looks up the therapist and sees that they've been writing or they've been talking about Palestine. And the therapist was then reprimanded by their clinical supervisor for doing so. Yeah, and there's more to this case. But I know of many cases where this is happening. And in fact, I just really want to emphasize that we have yet to capture the full breadth and depth of how mental health professionals across the global north, and Europe and North America in particular, are being managed and disciplined for speaking out on Palestine. So what's going on there? How can we make sense of it? How can we make sense of that? And why is that important? Let me give another case. And this is a case I often talk about, or one of the cases I talk about, which is that of a racialized Muslim woman who wears a niqab, and she went here in the UK to see to seek a therapist for her experience of trauma. And in the very first meeting with the therapist here, the therapist told her that one of the signs of successful treatment will be her ability to take off the niqab. Okay. Now that's very powerful. That's a very powerful experience. But there's something about this that's very relevant to Islamophobia, to racism, as it is relevant to Palestine. And this is a case example I often teach upon, because unless we understand history, unless we understand how racism operates, then we can't fully unpack and make sense of why it is the therapist took a position like this with the Muslim woman in front of them. And I think, well, I'll come back to this. Okay, so I just want you to hold on to that case example. When I talk about Islamophobia, I want to underline Islamophobia not necessarily just as, I think, overt forms of hostility. Often I think when people think about Islamophobia, they think about hate crimes, they think about verbal abuse, they think about physical abuse, okay? Now, this isn't the case example with the therapist that I just gave, but let's imagine the therapist with that Muslim woman. Let's say they were smiling and they really genuinely feel like they want to help that Muslim woman. They feel like they can liberate that Muslim woman or help her in her process of liberation. So I want you to imagine already that that therapist is smiling. Yeah. So there's something here about Islamophobia that's not just about overt hostility. And that's often why when I talk about Islamophobia, I think about it as the management of ideal Muslim ways of thinking and behaving, right? The boundaries of ideal ways for Muslims to think and behave. And this is obviously especially true for Muslims, as I'm going to get to, but is not limited to Muslims as we see for Palestine, right? And here's where we have to make this distinction. And I'm going to unpack that case example and bring it back to Palestine. So I'm trying to, I guess, inception this explanation by going several layers deeper, and then I'm going to work my way backwards, okay? We have to understand here the difference between liberal and illiberal forms of racism. Malcolm X famously spoke about that distinction between wolves and foxes. Wolves are those racists who are out to get you. They're very explicit in their racism, right? They'll have a wholesale demonization of Muslims, of Black people, etc. And they're very explicit about it. Liberal racism doesn't operate in the same way. Liberal racism operates in a way that it's not saying, I hate all Muslims. It's saying that there are good Muslims out there and there are bad Muslims out there, right? And so according to certain logics, certain Muslims are bad, and there's a way of dividing the good Muslims from the bad Muslims. And there are many ways in which Muslims are racialized. And when I teach on this, this takes a number of hours and a number of days. But let me give two examples. The first example I often give is about post 9/11. There's a mosque that's not far from where the Twin Towers used to stand. And that mosque has always been there, but the management of that mosque suddenly wanted to renovate. And by the demand of wanting to renovate, suddenly it brought the mosque's existence to public attention. Okay. So now, because people suddenly realize that, oh, there's a mosque near ground zero, people all of a sudden wanted to stop that mosque from literally existing. So protests arose. There's people literally demonstrating on the streets, and this was in the mid-2000s. There was these two Egyptian Christian Coptic Christians. They're Egyptians, so they might look somewhat like me, right? Who heard about this protest and these demonstrations, heard about the mosque, and wanted to join it. So they flew down, or they went down to the demonstration. And the moment they showed up, they got beat up by the protesters. And this is really important for us to understand when we're thinking about racialization. These two Egyptian Christians were racialized as Muslim, even though they don't identify as Muslim, right? So the process of racialization is really, really significant. The way our bodies already speak for ourselves before we can even say anything is very, very significant. It speaks to how people are racialized differently across space and time. The way we're racialized is important to the political context that we're in. For example, in the war on terror, post 9/11, Muslims were racialized to threat to the nation, to violence. And so what readily happened is because these Egyptians were racialized as Muslim, even though they don't identify as Muslim, they were attacked for being Muslim, okay? And the element of how Muslims are racialized to threat and regressiveness is so deeply embedded within the public consciousness of the global north in the Western world. There was a study conducted in Germany that I think, and I often use this as a case example, that I think is very revealing of the fear of terrorism. So there was an empirical research study done looking at why do people fear terrorism? Where is it coming from? And there might be one logical explanation why people might fear terrorism is because they fear the threat towards them. They fear this experience of crime, right? Like we might have to varying degrees a fear of crime or criminality or whatever it might be. And that's obviously also racialized. But there's an element of fear of just that experience of violence towards ourselves. But what they actually found in that study was that the fear of terrorism was less associated with a fear of crime and more associated with anti-Muslim prejudice. In other words, the less that people liked Muslims or had bad ideas of Muslims, the more they actually had a fear of terrorism. And that was actually much more significantly correlated. And so this idea of how Muslim and Muslimness is racialized to terrorism, to threat, especially through the war on terror, is really important now, moving a step backwards, between this distinction between liberal and illiberal racism. If illiberal racism is saying, I hate all Muslims, unequivocally, liberal racism comes in the war on terror and says, well, there's good Muslims who are not terrorists, and there's bad Muslims who are terrorists. Okay? And this speaks to the process of racialization, obviously, where it becomes then irrelevant to how people identify. And then obviously the fluidity of what that even means, I'm going to get to. But I just want to say that process of racialization is actually really significant, not only for Muslims. In fact, Freud, in the biography of Freud, there's a really relevant moment, actually, which I find really interesting when he was going to university. And Freud was not a practicing Jew, so to speak, but he recalls a moment when he was going to university and he was discriminated against. And in that moment of being discriminated against as a Jew in what was liberal sort of Germany prior to World War II, this brought him closer to his Jewishness as an identity, and this is something that he admits to, right? And I think there's something about, obviously, the context that's very relevant to our own experiences of Muslimness, especially in times of Islamophobia. Now, we explain now that Muslims are racialized a threat through the war on terror. We explain the difference between liberal and illiberal racism. Let's bring it back to the Muslim woman in the therapy room. And here we understand immediately that the fact that she's wearing a niqab, remember, the therapist, let's imagine they're smiling, because Malcolm X makes the distinction between wolves and foxes. The wolves are those who are trying to bite you. They're showing their teeth. And the foxes are those that are smiling at you and they're inviting you to come in. And then eventually they bite you, right? And so let's imagine this therapist in all her warmth wants to help liberate this Muslim woman from her aggressive cultural practice. Where is that coming from? Where is that logic coming from? We know that since, especially the Iraq War, but even before that, the Iraq War was historically justified on liberating Muslim women from their cultural and religious sort of regressive environment. And so she's coming in with this idea of, oh, I can help save you, I can protect you, right? Obviously, this was a very discriminatory experience for that Muslim woman, but it speaks to the fact that, oh, you are kind of, if we think about Islamophobia as managing an ideal way of thinking and behaving, then the therapist has sort of naturally inculcated this idea that this Muslim woman is kind of in a bad Muslim territory, and she can support her in becoming a good Muslim, right? And the distinction between good Muslim and bad Muslim is also very relevant for us for condemnation politics, which we're seeing right now, which is very racist, right? I mean, there's an entire book, I highly recommend it, and I'll post it later in the chat, called I Refuse to Condemn. Because the idea for Muslims now to be questioned, do you condemn Hamas or not? There's an immediately, and we should be always aware of that, there's an immediate racist implication of that, right? The racist implication is that if you do not condemn, you are a bad Muslim. And if you're a bad Muslim, you don't belong to the society. To be fair, also, we also have to unpack a little bit further. Maybe for the sake of time, I won't do that. But it's also not an actual question, because there's material and immaterial conditions that are impacting our ability to express solidarity, for example, for Palestine, right? So it's a highly securitized question. Just to unpack this point, there's three possible answers to that question. If you're asked to condemn, you only have really three possible answers. You either condemn, you accept the question, okay? And by doing so, you're accepting the racist logic that you as a Muslim must first condemn to have a voice. And that's highly problematic for many different reasons, not least that you're actually reifying, you're legitimizing the racism behind the question itself, okay? Yet if you deny, if you say, no, I don't condemn Hamas, theoretically, that also immediately puts you at risk, because in the global north, to support Hamas has material conditions. Here in the UK, I think it's Article 12 of the Counterterrorism Act, that you're supporting Hamas, right? So it's actually a non-question. You actually don't have all of the opportunities to answer that question in all the possible ways that you would like. You can't answer it in one way because that's a criminal offense. If you accept it, it's racist, and you're reifying the racist logic that underlines it. And then if you avoid or try to intellectualize it, and maybe someone could be even putting that on me right now, that I'm just intellectualizing the question. But by avoiding or intellectualizing it, that just puts me still on the boundary. Am I a good Muslim or a bad Muslim? they might not have recourse. There might not be a criminal offense behind the fact that I'm avoiding it. But because I'm not immediately condemning, I'm not a good Muslim. Okay. And this speaks to sort of how just from the very existence of the Counterterrorism Act here, and the fact that Hamas is prescribed, and the fact that Hamas then is associated with Palestinian resistance in different shapes and forms, there are immediate disciplinary measures for supporting Palestinian resistance. Whereas there are no disciplinary measures for anyone who shows support for Israel or the genocide that's going on right now. And that fundamentally is already a glaring example of institutional racism in the global north, but especially as it applies to psychology and mental health settings in which we operate, because now suddenly you can have patients and clients who can express any forms of support for Israel, but immediately, because of the material and immaterial conditions, material being actual criminal offense, but immaterial being that element of being disciplined and managed under the guise of, are you a good Muslim or a bad Muslim? That those two together, material and immaterial, come together to discipline our ability to actually show support for Palestine and or Palestinian resistance in all its shapes and forms. So that brings me then to what I think is actually really quite relevant to psychology, which is the growth of counterterrorism and counter-extremism, because this brings us back full circle when we're trying to locate politics and mental health. This isn't the only example of this. It's just one very glaring example of it, that psychology has long played a role. And this is the third section, by the way, and hopefully I'm going to try to finish with the next 15 minutes, inshallah. That the side disciplines have played a long role in providing the language, the vehicle for managing dissent, for managing opinions and thoughts and behaviors that are critical of the state. And that's long been the case, but especially for racialized minority communities. And we know this, for example, Jonathan Metzl has a book called The Protest Psychosis. And he talks about how here, and I'll read this quote, that in 1968, there were these psychiatrists who spoke about schizophrenia as a protest psychosis, whereby Black men developed hostile and aggressive feelings, delusional anti-whiteness after listening to Malcolm X or joining Black Muslims, or aligning with groups that preached militant resistance to white society. So we see here how the side disciplines immediately had this way of pathologizing, the civil rights movement and Black men developing a politics that, that the United States didn't find palpable. That's one example. The other example that's very common that's used is Soviet Union with sluggish schizophrenia. We know that for anyone who doesn't know, it's a common reference to talk about how mental health disciplines become political tools in capturing people and locking them up when they showed critical thoughts and opinions. And instead of just doing it just outright like that, instead of police coming to your door, the whole point is that they're diagnosed with something called sluggish schizophrenia. Now, I find this example is often overstated, not in the fact that the Soviet Union didn't lock up dissenting opinions on the pretense of mental illness, which we know they did. It's because there's a presumption that sluggish schizophrenia was created for that purpose. But rather, it's revealing of the way that dissenting opinion, sluggish schizophrenia already pre-existed. There was a history of sluggish schizophrenia prior to its usage in this way. And I think it speaks volumes to the way in which existing mental health frameworks are operationalized in a way to manage dissent, right? And this is really, really important. It's not like schizophrenia was suddenly introduced in this way. But if we want to think about in the current context in North America and Europe, we have to think about how existing mental health frameworks can be operationalized in a way to manage dissent, let's say, towards the state, but also, let's say, particularly in support of Palestine. There's obviously a lot written on the way Palestinian resistance. I mean, there's so much written on this, on the way Palestinian resistance is pathologized in journals, even to the point where their brains are quasi-dissected through neuroimagery, right? They find people, some studies have shown that they've been literally doing brain scanning with Palestinian resistance fighters, trying to find what it is in the brain that leads them to resistance. And all of this is speaking to US history, Soviet Union, also what's happening right now in Palestine. And when I talk about this, I often have an issue with my students because I think they often now somehow just localize all these examples to a different space and time. US history happened a long time ago. Soviet Union happened a long time ago in a different place. Palestine might be happening right now. The way mental health disciplines are managing and criminalizing them. But it's not happening here. And what I really want to emphasize is how we can explore this happening here and now in North America, in Europe. And to this, we need to understand counterterrorism and counter-extremism and how they've expanded, specifically with regards to the side disciplines, with regards to psychology and psychiatry. So this one example I often give is here in the UK, and I'm very interested in thinking about it across different contexts. Here in the UK, there is something called the PREVENT strategy. And the PREVENT strategy is a public duty upon hospitals, teachers, to try to identify and report individuals they suspect might become terrorists or radicalized, okay, in the future. So imagine you're a mental health professional, you're working here in the UK, you go through something called PREVENT training, and you're given this duty to report ostensibly to the police people you think might become terrorists or might become radicalized in the future. And one of the ways they do this is highly psychologized. So obviously, I already explained to you, so hopefully by now you understand that Muslimness and threat, especially the threat of terrorism, are deeply intertwined in public consciousness. So one of the liberal ways of saying, let's go try to figure out who terrorists are in the future without being completely racist about it, right? Without saying, go look after Muslims, but no, go after people you suspect might be terrorists, is by psychologizing it, by saying, look out for people who might be emotionally vulnerable, right? I'll give an example. In one of the PREVENT trainings I went to, one of the PREVENT trainers was saying, you know what? Someone who might be susceptible to becoming a terrorist or radicalized is a young adolescent who might gain a lot of confidence or might lose a lot of confidence. And I was kind of sitting there like, wait, I was trying to be a fly on the wall and not interrupt, but we're talking about adolescence and people fluctuating in confidence. So I raised my hand and I said, what do you mean exactly? Isn't it like part of adolescence that we actually, fluctuate in our confidence? To which she responded, yes, I know this might be a little bit confusing, but it's important to trust your gut. Okay. So this whole point now of what it comes down to, the way it's operationalized, is to trust your gut, right? So mental health professionals are asked to trust their guts in looking for vulnerability or psychological vulnerability among their patients that they suspect might become radicalized and supporting of terrorist groups, right? So this is really important, this element of trusting your gut, because in fact, what it's doing is that it's institutionalizing through a psychological framework, racist gut feelings, right? That association between Muslimness and threat is institutionalized as a policy. And we know already that Prevent has been going after people who've been speaking out on Palestine. There's already a very famous case example of a Muslim youth who wanted to organize an event at his school on Palestine. The school, or someone in the school, made a Prevent referral, so made a referral to the police because they thought this youth, because he's organizing for Palestine, is susceptible to radicalization or supporting terrorism. And the police showed up to him and told him, don't be a radical. Don't be so radical. Okay. So there's already, and there's a lot of case examples of how Palestinian solidarity is intertwined within the logics of counterterrorism. This is actually really, really significant. It's not only here, but actually in the history of terrorism studies in the global north, there was already a deep implication of Israel was already deeply embedded within the sort of construction of the counterterrorism field. And so historically, even in the databases, attacks on Palestinian soil were never sort of categorized as terrorism, but attacks on Israel, quote unquote, soil were then categorized in terrorism databases, which skewed obviously already the understanding of where terrorism is and where it's to be found. But there's a very deep implication already for Palestinian solidarity and Palestinian resistance. Now we're putting the two and two together. I know this might sound a little bit complicated, but there's only really two things you have to hold on to. One is that counter-extremism, counter-terrorism is already, or these constructs are already hyper-racialized to Muslims and to Palestinians. And that's one thing. And the other thing you have to hold on to is how this becomes embedded as a policy within mental health settings. And even not, if not explicit as a policy, but maybe in North America and Canada and other places, might just be embedded within the logics of mental health professionals, okay? If we put these two together, we see something actually really quite astounding, which is a development that's happening right now in the UK, where there's these things called mental health hubs. And mental health hubs are where these potential extremists, like this young Muslim, his name is Muhammad, he's now deemed as potential extremist, as susceptible to radicalization. So they refer him to this mental health hub for a mental health assessment, okay? And they find, so now imagine all these people like Muhammad, so many people who've been talking about Palestine. This isn't the only case, this isn't the only way to understand it, but I'm giving this as a case example. Imagine 100 youth, and the majority of people referred to these mental health hubs are young Muslim adults, okay? They're being referred to these mental health hubs for mental health assessment because remember, the logic is that they have some sort of psychological vulnerability, which is leading them down this path of supporting something like Palestine or Palestinian resistance. And then you make this mental health assessment for all of them. You have 100 Muslim youth, you're doing a mental health assessment for all of them, okay? And the police make a note. So you get your results. There's trauma, there's let's say they'll say psychotic, they'll say emotional and behavioral dysfunction, they'll say distress, they'll say there's nothing. You know, let's say most people have nothing, but some people seem to have certain other traits or attributes or assessments or diagnoses. And the police make a really interesting point. And remember, I should mention very quickly, this came from a Freedom of Information request. I know that complicates it a little bit, but the police didn't disclose this. This is people requesting this information from the police, that in one of the police reports, they make an interesting point that, oh, the amount of people in which the assessment concluded that they're distressed is very low. But the amount of youth who, again, the category we're talking about are maybe young Muslims who've been referred to for extremism, the amount of them that are diagnosed with emotional and behavioral dysfunction is very high. The police themselves are making that note. And they're saying that most likely a lot of people who are distressed are being diagnosed with emotional dysfunction. The emotional dysfunction would be like, you're not regulating your anger very well. And this is where we see the political function in practice of psychology, right? Because one of the things that's very interesting here is that the jump between distress and emotional dysfunction is a political jump. When we say a Muslim youth is distressed by Ahmed Shabet, by the fact that he was bombed 3 times and lost his entire family and then lost his legs. And I'm very angry and upset about it in a way that I find is very difficult to contain. The difference between distress and dysfunction is a political one to say distress is legitimate. You are legitimately distressed by something that's happening that we recognize and is legible to us. And emotional dysfunction is to say you have a hard time regulating the anger that you have, that anger is what is not justified, right? And the police themselves note that it seems like the youth who are distressed are actually being pathologized with emotional dysfunction. And this is a very glaring point that we're going to be seeing, that we are seeing, but is most likely happening across the mental health settings across Europe, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Canada, United States, where the distress of bearing witness to a genocide is not legitimized politically and is therefore what? Pathologized psychologically, right? And this is one of the sort of key issues that we're confronting right now. Sorry, I thought someone was trying to speak.
No, 5 minutes more.
Okay, great. So I'll just end it right now, actually. We have now a problem in thinking about mental health, in thinking about our framing of what's happening in Palestine through mental health discourse, because there's this depoliticizing impulse. And this is something that's already been spoken about, the use of trauma. Dr. Samah Jaber has mentioned that the only reason they use trauma, the only reason she talks about trauma about Palestinians is because it's legible to the West. It's a way for them to make sense of what's happening. But that in and of itself, she recognizes, and what we know from trauma discourse is already depoliticizing, because it's not recognizing the problem with trauma. And I won't unpack this too much right now. Maybe we can bring it up in the Q&A if you like. Is that it kind of equalizes. It speaks to the fact that we're all susceptible to trauma. So you could conduct a study and you can find out, many Israelis are traumatized by this current conflict, but many Palestinians are also traumatized, right? And it creates this false equivalence between a settler colonial project and those who are being colonized. And of course, in Islam, injustice transcends people's experience of it. I think it's really important for me to emphasize this. Even if people who've been removed from their home during the Nakba are not experiencing daily distress because of that one moment anymore, that doesn't erase the criminal act behind it, nor their right to return, right? Like for us, our legitimacy of an injustice does not require for us, let's say within an Islamic framework, that that is predicated on people's experience, right? I know I said these 2 points very bluntly. There's a lot more for me to say on to that. I'm well aware that I'm maybe 1 minute after my timing. I had other thoughts on moving forward, but I pray, hopefully, inshallah, up until now, most of the things are clear, and I'm really happy to keep sharing other thoughts as a Q&A comes in. Jazakumullah khair wa barakallahu feekum.
Jazakallah khairan, dear Dr. Tarek. Please, round of applause to Dr. Tarek for this amazing lecture and for shedding light with regards to how to deal with Islamophobia and the connection between Islamophobia, mental health, psychology, and of course, the Palestinian cause and the dehumanization of Palestinians through the lens of psychology as well. I really appreciate your lecture. I think all of our participants, all of our excellent brothers and sisters, I really appreciated a lot of questions in the Zoom chat, a lot of reflections, a lot of aha moments, I think, for all of us who are mental health professionals or students of knowledge generally. The topic is very important, and not only for the global north, but also for the global south and the global west and the global east, because even in Muslim countries, unfortunately, psychology has become a tool of, in a sense, dehumanization as well. Professor Malik Badri, rahimullah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him, in his book, The Dilemma of the Muslim Psychologist, and Professor Badri is the father of modern Islamic psychology, a Sudanese scholar. He actually was criticizing the psychologists and psychiatrists from the Muslim world as well, and the Middle East, North Africa, for sometimes subconsciously normalizing tendencies that are colonial in its nature and disconnects Muslims from truly being in a state of self-determination and empowering, and also to detach ourselves from our own knowledge, epistemology in a sense, you know. And we also understand, Dr. Tarek, through your excellent reflections and excellent scholarly work, and other scholars that we brought in and practitioners like Dr. Sama and other excellent Palestinian psychologists, psychiatrists, but also generally throughout the world, that psychology has been used as a tool of justifying colonization, for sure, and justifying apartheid and justifying occupation, both in its origin after the Renaissance and the so-called Enlightenment of the European context, where actually through Enlightenment, as you are saying on a broader term, yet today is used as a way of, educating the colonized or the savages, quote to quote, let's educate them through psychology, human rights, or how to deal with, gender relationships, or how to deal with diversity of thoughts and diversity of living, or diversity of expressions and diversity of reflections, justifying, and through psychology, dehumanizations of not only Muslims, but people of color and the colonized, whether it's in Latin America, Caribbeans, and the African continent, and of course the Middle East, West, and Asia, of course. So we are in solidarity with all people, not only Muslims, with regards to colonization, and this is something that we need to do as an interfaith initiative, where Muslims, Christians, Jews, and other faith tradition, Buddhists, people from other faith tradition join, but also people that are from other traditions of thoughts as well. We unite in the umbrella of decolonization and decolonization of psychology. And as advocates of Islamic psychology, Dr. Tarek, because ISIP is also advocating for Islamic psychology, of course, which is a beautiful tradition that we have in our own sacred tradition as Muslims. We cannot reconnect to fitra, to our natural disposition of purity, without decolonizing ourselves. Because through socialization layers in our upbringing in this world, which is very much disconnected from living, healthy lifestyles due to, capitalism and other ideologies that are disconnecting us from being part of the ecosystem that God Almighty has created. In order to reconnect, we need to decolonize, because we're all subconsciously affected by them. And as psychologists, as counselors, as psychotherapists, as mental health professionals, we are also not immune from this, as you mentioned. How do we diagnose people with trauma? How do we diagnose people with different types of, struggles, like, for instance, PTSD, where actually Dr. Sama, in a very excellent manner, mentioned that PTSD is a diagnosis that was given to war veterans from America. This is not the case for Palestinians who are suffering on a daily basis of occupations and genocides and and settler violence. We need to reimagine and figure and re-reflect the whole notion of diagnosis from the aspect of mainstream psychology, and also to look at trials and tribulations from the aspect of Islamic psychology is also something that we can reconnect to the word of sumud, which is a word that Dr. Sama often speaks about, which could mean resilience, but has other definitions as well. And from our aspect of advocates of Islamic psychology, bala, how do we deal with bala? How do we deal with trials and tribulations? Is it a way for us to gain spiritual and psychological growth? How do we decolonize so that we don't allow psychology to dehumanize people, and particularly Palestinians, Muslims, people of color, and other oppressed people all over the world? So these are some of the thoughts that you have shared with us, Dr. Tarek, that I find very valuable, and some of my own reflections from our own work with ISIP. We're very honored to host you. And I'm going to now ask some of the questions from the chat to you, Dr. Tarek. And then finally, before we end, we would love to summarize with some reflections of how do we move forward, because we also would like to bring some action items to all of our excellent brothers and sisters in the Zoom webinar today, because we have so much knowledge amongst our participants. They're all doing an amazing work, but also how can we interconnect to the connection of decolonization is the first path. But what is the solution after decolonization? Decolonization is only the tool. It's not the end game. The end game is that we need to bring something that will be the solution. Because decolonization, in a sense, is a reaction. And then from the reaction, which we need in many ways, we need action. So yes, we're going to fight Islamophobia, but then what do we bring for action? And this is there are some of these things I would like to speak with you on all of our excellent colleagues and members in the webinar. We'll start with Sister Zainab. She's actually asking as we speak, Dr. Tarek, how to counter assumptions based on propaganda? How do we counter assumptions based on propaganda? Any nasiha and guidance?
How to counter assumptions that are come based on propaganda. So maybe if you can clarify that, because I'm not so sure if you're speaking directly towards like Israeli propaganda, or if you're speaking to the assumptions like the racialization of Muslims. So if people are racialized towards threat, how to counter that? I'm not so sure exactly.
If you can answer perhaps the second part of the question, because that's relevant to your lecture as well, essentially the second.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I think we have a big problem with that one, because one way of the idea of countering it speaks to the fact that I don't want us to understand racism as a cognitive distortion that people have. Like some people have these bad opinions of Muslims, and maybe we can counter it in terms of like having intellectual or rational conversations with them. I think it's really important to understand when I'm using the examples of counterterrorism, I'm speaking towards actual institutional practices. And I'm going to give you a very clear example here. I had in my research one white woman, middle-class white woman, who she's a GP. A patient came in. He's wearing a long thobe. He has a long beard, and they're friendly with each other. They like each other, and I know her, so she's being very honest with me. And she told me suddenly, when he spoke about homeschooling his children, she suddenly thought about, oh, is this a counter extremism referral? Is this person, and I'm gonna I usually unpack this in class for a long time. But what happened was at 9/11, what used to be questions of integration for Muslims in the global north, you're either integrate into our society or get the hell out, right? That's the way it was before 9/11. After 9/11, it became you either integrate into our society or you're a potential security threat. So suddenly that's the idea of if this person taking his children away from school, from public school to homeschool his children so they don't integrate British values. She suddenly aware of all this. Now it's really important to speak to her awareness. She knows the racialized logic that's operating in that moment, but she feels suffocated because in the setting that she's in, she feels pressured to act upon that racialized logic. You see what I mean? And so in a way, what I think we need to understand and mobilize on as Muslims is to unpack and understand. Well, first understand, then unpack, and then mobilize upon the racist policies that are being embedded across the global north. I'm talking about border policing. I'm talking about security policies like counterterrorism. All of these and more, and even policies on gang violence. I can give examples of how a Black youth was picked up from the street here in London. When you're Black and racialized as Black here in London, you're 30 times more likely to be stopped and searched in London. They stop and search a Black youth, the police, and then they discovered that he was Muslim. So he might have been Somali, and I think he was Somali. And then they referred him to counter extremism. So that Black youth actually, if through our understanding of intersectionality, is actually he's caught between two forms of racialized of racist violence that's embedded within policies and strategies. One being about stop and search policies, and the other one being about counter extremism. And unless we mobilize on those, there's literally nothing you could do in terms of training with the police, with healthcare professionals, that's going to make a difference. Because again, if I bring it back to that first example, it didn't matter that she was aware. The suffocation that she experienced came from the fact that she was operating in a context. And we're going to see that with mental health professionals and others right now. They may, in fact, feel like, let's say a Muslim youth comes to them and they express solidarity for Palestinian resistance. Now, that mental health professional may themselves express the same support for Palestinian resistance. But because of the pressure in the institutions they operate within, they feel like for their own professional protection and autonomy, they have to make a referral. This is where we have to start mobilizing collectively. And there's organizations, to be very practical here, because I know Brother Saeed, mashallah, is going to keep talking to me about having to give very practical examples. There are groups across the global north that are mobilizing on these things, like CAGE here in the UK, there's SEDA in Denmark, there's NCCM in Canada. I'm sure there's others as well that I'm not mentioning. We have to be supporting these groups that are holding these policies and strategies to account, because that's where the actual like work has to take place.
MashaAllah. Barakallah feekum, Dr. Tarek. Amazing reflections and amazing nasiha and guidance. Definitely these organizations are very important. And inshallah, as I said, we will be at service for all these themes and topics. We will share all these organizations' details. We will also establish task forces to work for the plight of Palestinians and also to resist Islamophobia and dehumanizations of Muslims, people of color generally within the psychology field. Inshallah. There are a lot of other questions. I'll ask Salsabil is asking, I think it's a must that we familiarize ourselves with the CC9 Charity Commission guidance that charities and nonprofit organizations like the BPS and TSA, the Scout associations, are using to justify their silence or choosing not to call for a ceasefire. Despite the guidance itself stating that charities are permitted to engage in political activity and campaigns and can even use emotive or controversial material. Question: will acknowledging and condemning attacks on non-Muslims or by Muslims on Muslims help validate and diffuse the resentment, fear of Muslims?
Sorry, I think I might need to. I couldn't find or read the question. Can you maybe repeat the question or at least summarize it?
All right, I'll summarize the question. Will acknowledging and condemning attacks on non-Muslims or by Muslims on Muslims help validate and diffuse the resentment, fear of Muslims?
No, condemning will never do that. It's really important to acknowledge where the process and the force of condemnation comes from. And that's one that's inherently racist. When you reproduce a racist framework, you actually are not doing anything but supporting it, right? There's a whole book on this. I will write it out maybe very quickly on chat called "I Refuse to Condemn." Maybe someone can link it, where that's also been, what I'm saying right now has also been validated empirically, right? So people have looked at, how much Muslims have potentially condemned attacks and how that's changed public opinion on Muslims. And it doesn't change public opinion because the very impulse to condemn is one that's fundamentally embedded within a racist logic that Muslims do not belong unless they condemn. And in fact, I'll take it one step further. I'll be really honest with you. this is where, and I talk about this in my own chapter, and maybe I'll share. So one of the chapters of I Refuse to Condemn is my own quasi autobiography where I talk about this. And I was held by, when we play the good Muslim, if any of us play the good Muslim, we're immediately throwing people under the bus who might not have that ability and that privilege to play the good Muslim, right? If I'm going through border policing, right? I'm trying to go to, let's say, another country, and then I tell them, look, I condemn terrorists. I'm a really good Muslim. I'm a psychologist. That's very legible to you guys, right? Everybody loves psychologists. And I had the opportunity and I did that. I did that. And I regretted it so deeply when I did it. Because what did I just do? I just threw the next Muslim under the bus who didn't have the privilege of being a psychologist, who didn't have the opportunities that I had and the blessings that I had in my life, who might be, for his own literal political agency, that he's allowed to not condemn. He's allowed to choose and say, I refuse to condemn. That's a democratic, that is an absolute democratic right. The moment I condemn, I'm already throwing the next person under the bus who refuses, right? So there has to be a collective understanding as to the violence of the question, but also what the violence of what it reproduces when we engage with that question in a way that substantiates it. And I hope that point is really clear, because really we're going to see much more of this happening right now, and it is getting much worse.
Thank you so much, brother, for highlighting, and I totally agree with you. And I think that just, a strategy is to, bring it back to the majority society that wants you to do this and do that and condemn and condemn. Do they condemn things? Are they asked the same questions? Are they put in the same positions? Are they put into the same, benchmark or whatever you want to use as a terminology when it comes to condemnation, this and that? Why do not people condemn the war in Iraq? Why don't we ask the journalists, why don't you condemn the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan? Why don't you condemn it? It's kind of like we as Muslims are collective, and Western, people are individuals. And this is also part of the racist Islamophobic logic, is to collectivize us and don't see us as individuals, that there are different movements within Islamic thought. There are different movements amongst Muslims. Muslims are not one homogenic type of people. We have different cultural backgrounds. We have different understanding, even though we're united in Quran and Sunnah, of course, and Tawheed as Muslims. But then you have Muslims from different, different views and different ideologies, So this is definitely the stereotypical, depiction of, of the minorities in West, homogenic views of us, while the diversity of thought is accepted for the majority population, of course. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. And this is something that I also think we need to be mindful of, because as you say, the dehumanization starts by also looking at the Muslim man and woman as a threat, as a villain, and by us differentiating us with others, it's justifying subconsciously that type of vilification, instead of actually speaking about human rights and self-determination. And in the end of the day, we know that the plight of the Palestinians is beyond just Muslims. Palestinians are Christians, Palestinians could be Jews, and Palestinians could be of all types of shades of ideologies and thoughts, and Muslims, of course, from different backgrounds, and of course, people that are oppressed from different ideologies and faith backgrounds. So thank you, Dr. Tarek, for reflecting upon that together with us. Andrea is asking, are there books about politics and psychology that you can suggest?
Rafiki, I mean, alhamdulillah, I have a book written on this as it relates to, yes, and I just realized it was just shared. And I'm very happy, by the way. Honestly, wallahi, I don't get anything out of it, out of book purchases. My percentage that I get out of it is very, very low. So, I mean, but even if it was high, I'm very happy to share the PDF. If anybody would like it, I can send it to you almost immediately. If we can maybe find a way to organize that, inshallah, with ISIP.
For all of you who registered to the lecture today, Sister Fatima, could you share the registration link for those who haven't registered? We will email out the PDF to all of you who have registered. And we asked Dr. Tarek, we appreciate Dr. Tarek. Dr. Tarek, just if it's a book publishing house, just so that we don't get any issues. But with that said, we would love to disseminate your knowledge.
Yeah, no, I have to be careful how I say it, obviously, but I mean, let's say for those who
We'll
are
edit it
interested,
out.
we can find a way to get it to them, inshallah.
Edit it out, inshallah, so that we know what it gets problem. But inshallah, register yourself, Sister Fatima, our excellent colleague. She's the one who summarized the lecture, by the way, on the Zoom chat. So she is very good in summarization. Inshallah, we will send it. Thank you so much for your generosity, Dr. Tarek, and allowing us. I have a recommendation, actually. I forgot the author. It's called Psychology Without a Soul. It's about actually the whole creation of modern psychology from being a science of the soul, but this is from a religious point of view, but it's still interesting. I'm noticing that we have a lot of non-Muslims here as well. Welcome to ISIP, by the way. This is a movement for all of you as well. It's a very interesting notion of how we went from psychology of the soul to psychology without a soul, and psychology that was running the errands of the colonizers as well. I will try to find the link, and we will email it out to all those who registered, inshallah. All right.
And certainly, if I may just add very quickly, there's also other books that I can recommend. I just wrote a review, for example, for psychoanalysis under occupation, which I can really recommend, written by the professors Sheehy and Sheehy. That speaks directly to Palestinian context, and inshallah, I'll have my review of that also out soon. But also, just to let you know that a lot of people have spoken about the politics of the mental health disciplines from other approaches, like the Marxist approach, right? So understanding psychology's deep implication within capitalist structures and sort of the commodification of distress. A lot of that has been written. I think all of that is valuable for us. It's very important for me to just emphasize that we don't only have to think about in terms of racism, because if we think about racial capitalism and all the different ways that Muslims are implicated within wider society, we have to be far more well-read, I think, in all these different approaches.
MashaAllah. I agree. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think it's important for us as practitioners and students that there is a diversity of thought also within decolonization. It's very important to speak. There is not one approach in decolonization, and it's important. At the end of the day, we believe in diversity of thought, whether we're united and learning from each other. We don't need to agree on everything. We can have, as we have in our Islamic tradition, adab al-ikhtilaf, which is to have a good conduct when it comes to difference of opinion, but still learn from each other. So definitely resources from other traditions are very valuable. In the end, as part of decolonization, is to not go back to the hegemonic way of secular notions, in the sense that, I shouldn't say secular, I should say Western colonial notions, because it's often portrayed as it's one way of thinking when it comes to human rights. It's one way of thinking when it comes to justice. But justice actually is to be able to have self-determination. And then we can, in that, have peace, which culture background we have, religious background we have, and respecting each other for peace and prosperity, which is the aim of all of our goal. So we do believe, as students of Islamic psychology, in diversity of studying. And that there is not one way of approaching, for instance, decolonization. There are multiple ways. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much, Dr. Tarek. Brother Mahsan is writing, I see the self-interest argument, Dr. Younis, but it is solely a matter of suffocation, or is there an element of inculcation as well? I often feel that these individuals are epistemically committed to the underlying worldview.
Mashallah, I think if it's Dr. Mohsen Athar, I want to say, mashallah, he's definitely a scholar in his own right. But if I understand his question correctly, and I pray, please forgive me if you can just maybe clarify by they or the people you're referring to, if it's like mental health professionals or like, I guess, mental health professionals of Global North. I think, okay, yeah. I think certainly there's a lot about, I should say, that's such a good question, because one of the things we don't have that should really be recognized is that actually we don't know the politics of Global North professionals. It's very strange, actually. Reality in psychology is that there's a lot of research on like the political psychology or ideologies of people, but rarely reflexively of actual psychologists, psychiatrists themselves. So we don't know fully what allegiances, what their political leanings are, all these things. There's one research that was done actually in the early 2000s United States that actually I think was quite revealing, that they're quote unquote liberal, but I think still quite revealing of more or less centrist approaches to politics. And I feel like there's an element of centricism that's sort of embedded epistemologically within within the professions of psychology, because of, as I was saying before, there's this conservative impulse. I think there's a sort of liberal and a conservative impulse within the disciplines of psychology to sort of recognize that there's a social environment and political environment that can be deeply hostile, but at the same time making it very much about, oh, you have ways that you can deal with that on your own, right? You have ways that in which there's something maybe inherently problematic in your experience of it. So I would say certainly it's epistemological. I'll be honest with you, I have also personal examples I can't pull up on just because they're not published, they're not public. But institutions, I would say our global north institutions in psychology are far more complicit, not just silent. I think they're far more complicit in ways that we're not fully appreciating because of the epistemological sort of the epistemological sort of justification it gives to imperial ventures.
Barakallahu fikum, Dr. Tarek. Thank you also to Ustad Mohsen for your excellent question. We have two more questions. Is it okay, Dr. Tarek, before we end?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
So these are quite quick. So Sister Sarah is asking, how can we or should we decolonize the psychology curriculum? She's asking for UK, but I would broaden it to the world. So how can we decolonize psychology curriculums according to you?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of the word decolonizing. I know, mashallah, we use it. This is personal. This is nothing with regards to ISIP or everyone that I deal with. I'm very happy to use it, and I've used it myself in different contexts. We can't decolonize even something that we don't understand. We don't even, like, I'll be honest with you, we have a very limited understanding as to what we're actually confronting right now in terms of the institutional practices, as the question was about epistemology, right? The epistemological foundations which brings a certain proximity to Zionism, which legitimizes Zionism or settler colonial practices. I'm talking about this on institutional levels. What ends up happening when we think about decolonizing without thinking materially how our disciplines are embedded within wider structures, it ends up becoming multicultural benchmarking, right? I've seen in my institution, other institutions, in which decolonizing is simply a question of having a Muslim at the table, having a Black person at the table, having a Jew at the table. That it ends up being a question of diversity of thought. But that's not what decolonization is, or otherwise would be a perversion of decolonization, right? Decolonization is recognizing within wider structures the ways in which people are subjugated and marginalized. And I think, I'm going to be really honest with you, I think our political literacy within mental health disciplines, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but we as psychologists, therapists, counselors, everyone who might be interested in this, we don't have a good political literacy because our disciplines don't provide us with political literacy, right? So immediately we're jumping over political literacy towards decolonization, which is kind of strange because that's where we start replicating this very status quo way of thinking about decolonization as to like, oh, Islamic psychology is an alternative and therefore decolonial. No, and I've written about that. Maybe I could share that article. Islamic psychology isn't immediately decolonial because it's not Western. Islamic psychology can very, very much be embedded within Western frameworks to perpetuate Western forms of marginalization within an Islamic psychology discourse. And we have to be very mindful of this. And I know that's slightly complicated answer to not answer your question, but I think
Can I?
we need I'll just mention one last point. I think we need a really interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, a very grassroots way of understanding how Muslims are marginalized. When we understand how Muslims are marginalized, all of us, I'm talking about undocumented migrants coming to global north, right? If we understand fully their experiences, we'll have a much better understanding of decolonization than we would just by sitting as psychologists. I'm very sorry, Brother Saeed.
No. We appreciate constructive feedback. We believe in adab al-ikhtilaf, Dr. Tarek. I love it.
It wasn't shade on you. It's wallahi, it's on me, and it's for all of us. I think we use
I
decolonizing a little bit easy.
Dr. Tarek, you're an amazing scholar. So who am I to even say something to you? You're much more knowledgeable than what I am. I'm just
what
I would say, I agree with you to 100%, but the but I will add is that everything can be used by the colonizers, of course. I mean, I come from Ahl Sunnah of Iran, and the Safavids destroyed the epistemology of Ahl Sunnah in Iran, and they were Muslims. So, I mean, in the end of the day, and this is 400 years ago, my teacher, Sheikh Abdul Hakim, he said this is one of the few times that Muslims created genocide and epistemicide towards other Muslims. So, in the end of the day, you're right. What I would add is actually that whether we call it decolonization or not, Dr. Tarek, I agree with you. We need to first and foremost understand what are we decolonizing. And if you speak about the movement of Islamization of knowledge, the IOK movement, which was Ismail Farouq's and Sheikh Said Naqib al-Atas movements that they established, they actually saw that in order to Islamicize, you need to understand mainstream psychology, mainstream knowledge. You need to be educated in it. Because what are we decolonizing if we don't understand what is, for instance, Freudian theory? What an Islamic approach is not to the Islamic approach towards knowledge is not to refrain from other traditions' knowledge. Quite the contrary, the Islamic way is to look at it and filter out the things that are not applicable, but utilize the things that are applicable. Sometimes I do see some reactionary movements within even decolonial thought rejecting everything that has to do with West. We're not against the West. We are against colonization. We're against imperialism. We're against capitalism. But there is a benefits in many of the Western, fields. We have some of the great scholars of Islam coming from West. We're not against West. And this is actually something Fanon also spoke about in Black Skin and White Masks as well. So I would say that from Islamic psychology, you can use Islamic psychology to oppress people. You can use Islamic psychology to empower people. And that's also something that we need to be mindful of. With that said, I really believe that one nasiha I want to give to myself and to fellow people that are interested in Islamic psychology in terms of psychology is that decolonization per se doesn't come, as you say, from adhering to psychology from other traditions, first and foremost. But at the same time, I would say that for us, integration of knowledge is not to reject knowledge from other traditions but for us, at least for myself as a Muslim, we try to filter out the things that are not applicable to in our benchmark Quran and Sunnah. Now, just to also add to another thing why we call Islamic psychology our movement. Islamic psychology is not the perfect term, but this is the term that everybody uses now, so we're using it, but there is a legitimate criticism towards the term that I do agree with, actually. So just because we're calling our movement ISIP doesn't mean that we cannot criticize the word. And just to add to that, we believe in integration. We believe in mizan and balance. We believe that decolonization is important, but it's not the end goal. This is our belief. I think you agree on that, Dr. Tarek. And we believe that it's 100%. Important about racism. Well, if we as oppressed people become the leaders and we win, we should not become the oppressors ourselves, because history has taught us that if the oppressed doesn't work with him or herself, they can also become the oppressors. This is something that we have seen. That's why we believe in meaning-making therapy, which is part of Islamic psychology, for instance, which is also what Viktor Frankl taught us through logotherapy after he survived Auschwitz, that I'm going to make meaning out of this. And he was a staunch anti-Zionist. We also believe in this methodology from the Islamic point of view. And finally, we believe in integration. What we see in institutions all over the Muslim world and all over the world is the disintegration, where you have, for instance, secular studies and religious studies. We don't believe in that. We believe that chemistry is religious studies. We believe that philosophy is religious study. We believe that medicine is religious studies. And traditionally in the Islamic universities all over the world, we used to integrate chemistry with Islam. So Ibn Sina was not going to the faculty of secular studies or faculty of liberal arts or to study philosophy, and then he went to Islamic study. It was all integrated. And integration is what we believe in as Islamic psychology. I'm so sorry, Dr. Tarek, I became so passionate when you became passionate.
Barakallahu feek. Wallahi, I really appreciate this. And I think I just want to emphasize we definitely don't disagree, right? And I think I'm happy for us to move forward with any word. I mean, any word can be unpacked and dissected, right? And I think it's important for us that we're like our frameworks are on the same page. And I think it certainly is.
Dr. Tarek, you're much more knowledgeable than myself. I see you as my teacher first and foremost.
Barakallahu feek. We're all students. That's why I love the name of this organization. MashaAllah, we're all students. We're all learning together.
Jazakallah khair. We are honored to have you with us, and we love you, and we believe in what you're doing. We support you 100%, and we believe everything that our brothers and sisters in the chat has written today. They're all contributing in amazing ways. Thank you for all of our brothers and sisters, all of our contributors, all of our members, all of those who joined the webinar today. Thank you for sharing your reflections and questions. Please forgive me as your host if I said anything wrong, did anything wrong. Rest assured that I'm a person with a lot of errors in my character. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that. If anything good came from ISIP, it's from my colleagues. All the mistakes are solid in mine. Dr. Tarek, thank you so much for your amazing thoughts. And we are open to criticism. Constructive feedback is the best to grow. This is what multiplexity stands for. We're united through, in this case, our support to Palestine and our support against racism and Islamophobia, but then we can have multiplexity and different ways of approaching it. And this is the beauty of our tradition in Islam. And we're very open to work with non-Muslims as well in this cause, because this is Islamophobia. Racism is the plight for all humanity, inshallah, and all oppressed people all over the world. Please, round of applause to Dr. Tarek, brothers and sisters. Give him a round of applause, please. We appreciate it. I love this heated discussion, by the way. I just got some more passion.
It wasn't heated right away. Just to let you know, I feel like this is, alhamdulillah, quite vanilla to many of the other conversations I tend to have. But let me also just say barakallahu feekum for having me and for giving me giving me a voice. I appreciate it. May Allah bless you for all the work that everyone does at ISIP. And I'm certainly happy to continue this conversation forward, inshallah. And we need to, and we can maybe talk another time about what are the sort of steps we can do to move forward, inshallah.
We'll work together, Dr. Tarek. We consider one of the leading scholars in, I'm afraid of saying decolonial psychology now. So whatever field you want to we consider you one of the leading scholars. With that said, terminologies are important to discuss because etymology is part of the knowledge construct of what oppresses us. I actually agree with Dr. Tarek that we need to go to the nitty-gritty, but at the same time, we need to think on the wider picture. So thank you for reminding us. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for rectifying myself personally, Dr. Tarek, and us as a movement. We're not above constructive feedback. This is part of our tradition. In the discussions between Imam Ghazali and Ibn Sina, I love to see how they're refuting each other in such an eloquent way. This is you did, but we learned. We never disconnected, Dr. Tarek, in our tradition and all of our brothers and sisters. Imam Ghazali never said, Ibn Sina, it's not worth studying. He was refuting some of his ideas. He didn't say his chemistry is nonsense. This is the beauty of the multiplexity of Islamic thought. We need to go back to that, not because a lot of our dogmatic black and white thinking is from the colonial era that has been internalized into us. This is not the tradition. The tradition refuted, but was also accumulative in its process. We learned from each other. We took away the ideas we thought was not fully correct. We added new ideas, but we never fully disregarded each other's contributions. This is why Islamic thought and Islamic psychology is accumulative. So thank you so much, Dr. Tarek, for giving us constructive feedback. Thank you so much for allowing us to learn. Thank you so much for doing your amazing work. We will support you. Brothers and sisters who participated today, thank you for joining us. I saw many of your reflections and questions, amazing questions. You all are sources of knowledge, allowing us to learn from you. And by the way, some of you are scholars, so please reach out to us. We would love to host you for lectures and webinars on ISIP. If you want to join the ISIP movement and organization, we have shared our WhatsApp groups, our YouTube channel, our email address. I will share my own details as well. Feel free to join our local regional chapters, our different task forces. Some of you want to work with decolonization of curriculums. We really want that as well. We will find another word, Dr. Tarek. We will discuss what we should use for word. But nevertheless, feel free to reach out. We can start a task force in that. If you guys want to do research, we have a research center, Al-Balkhi Institute, named after Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, the father of CBT. Dr. Tarek, in the Encyclopedia of Oxford, they don't mention Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. So maybe we should also fight for the plight of adding our scholars into the Encyclopedia of Psychology as well, because the Western narrative has denounced Abu Zayd al-Balkhi as the father of CBT. So ISIP's research center is called Al-Balkhi Institute. You're more than welcome to join, brothers and sisters. We would love to learn from you all. You're all amazing. Please forgive us for not addressing all of your questions. We tried our best. And without any further ado, Dr. Tarek, may I ask you, please, my beloved brother and Ustad, would you like to do an ending dua, inshallah, for us? You can do it in English.
Jazakumullah khair. Bismillah wa salatu ala Rasulullah. Ya Allah, bless us and increase our hearts, increase us in knowledge and wisdom, and firasa and basira. Bless our hearts and reunite us with our brothers and sisters in Palestine. Give justice to the brothers and sisters in Palestine and protect them from the experiences that they're going through right now and in the past. Forgive them and protect them in the future. Ya Allah, unite the entire community and make us a means of support to the community and make the community a means of support for ourselves. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
barakatuh. Thank you for a beautiful dua. May Allah free Palestine so that we all can meet in Palestine in the future and do conferences and lectures with our beloved brothers and sisters, inshallah, with Dr. Sama, Dr. Yasser, and all of our great mental health professionals. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be with them, and may Allah free Al-Aqsa, may Allah free Jerusalem, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala free Gaza, free Palestine, so that we all can be there with our brothers and sisters, and from all faith traditions, inshallah, together, united for humanity and for the Palestinian cause. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for all of our Palestinian brothers and sisters in diaspora, for all Muslims that are suffering through this Islamophobia, for all people of color and all oppressed people, no matter which color, no matter which ethnicity, no matter which faith background, all of the oppressed people, whether you feel oppression here or there, we make dua for all of you. Thank you, brothers and sisters. We'll meet each other on social media. See each other next week with Sheikh Idris on Saturday. Please forgive me for any shortcomings from my side. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ustad Mohsen, he disappeared. I wanted to speak with him.